오스트레일리아 탱크.
It was 1940. Great Britain and France just lost to the German offense. War was past the doorstep, so American factories got chock full of orders. The storm that originated in Europe shook the entire world, including Australia, a faraway British dominion in the southern oceans. The local officials could very well foresee a Japanese assault, so they got busy with an urgent rearmament of the army. Their own tank development attempts all failed, so the Australians had to ask their mother country for aid. In August of 1940, Colonel Watson, a Royal Artillery officer, set off to Australia. On his way there, he visited the United States to join an Australian mission studying foreign experience. The mission was particularly amazed by the M3 medium tank, and that impression later became the decisive factor for the layout of the Australian tank, with the transmission in the front and the engine in the rear. The designers also modeled the future tank's armor after the M3. It wasn't a carbon copy, of course. The Australian tank avoided the barbettes and sponsons and opted for a classic option with a single turret instead. The time until the spring of 1941 was spent settling on the design specifications. The engineers and the military ultimately agreed on a mass of 25 tons, 60 millimeters of effective thickness for armor, a 350 horsepower engine, and a driving range of 240 kilometers. The tank would use 2 Vickers machine guns and a 2-pounder, a gun that was also used by the Matilda and the Valentine. Of course, there's always much more detail in the design requirements. For instance, a strict limit on hull width imposed by the capability of railway transporters. The prospective tank was named the Sentinel. The Army expected more than 500 of these machines for multiple tank divisions, and they wanted them as soon as possible. How about 300 ready for action in August of 1942? Well, the Australians met with some serious trouble on the way there. The casting molds for the hulls took much longer than expected. The first batch had low-strength steel in the armor, and the engines would often overheat. Besides, the capacity of the local industry was no match for the new appetite. Despite all the plans, the first-ever standard Sentinel rolled off the factory floor in July of '42, and it was unreasonable to expect more than a couple dozen tanks a month at first. But no work was done in vain. Even for 1942, the Australians made a pretty good machine. Yes, it was inferior to many German or Soviet machines in a number of ways, but one could still compare it to the most widespread vehicles of the times, like the Panzer IV or the early T-34 tanks. The Sentinel's main flaw was its 2-pounder gun, but thankfully the engineers designed it to mount a different cannon too. The strongest Sentinel of the family was the AC-4, armed with a 17-pounder, like the early Centurion or the Sherman Firefly tanks. Mounting this large cannon required using a completely new turret with a wider turret ring. Despite the success, the military ended up ordering only 65 tanks instead of the previously discussed hundreds. The rest of the armor pool was filled with the M3 medium tanks and other combat vehicles. And once Australia solved its mass production issues, the home-brewed machines were no longer needed. The Sentinels were discontinued in 1945.
영국은 어떻게 보면 해군에서 유래된 기본이에요. 육지에 가는 배가 탱크잖아.